Who's ready for something spooky? Welcome to this year's Spooktober special. During this time of the year, popular culture, society, and everything else likes to particularly focus on the dead, on that which comes from the grave and the beyond. But as anyone who is a modern practitioner of anything pagan, and especially all things heathen, can tell you, there's a lot more out there that goes bump in the night than ghosts, draugr, and other various forms of disturbed dead. For this Halloween tide, I thought it'd be fun to dig into some of those things that creep and prowl just around the edges of what we would consider to be, well, maybe not polite, but certainly society. Now, before I really dive in, this episode is definitely going to get a bit spooky. So if hearing tales of creatures who seduce the unwary to watery or otherwise wild demises, stalk in the night, and otherwise terrorize and terrify, then this episode may not be for you. But if you're looking for a bit of heathen-flavored scary fun to go with your holiday season, then buckle up, and please keep your hands, feet, and all other limbs and assorted body parts inside the vehicle at all times. When it comes to the things that go bump in the Nordic night, there is a broad array of different kinds of beings, creatures, and other powers who dwell just beyond the realms of what are considered to be human. On a deeper level, I think they serve something of a valuable purpose, not because any theology really needs to have designated tormentors, scourges, or any of those other kinds of things, but rather because they remind us of our place in the bigger world. The different beings that we're going to get into in this episode each represent the limits of what humanity and the human experience can really touch on and to an extent control. Control, by the way, is really a good place to start for thinking of these different beings, though it is quite likely that each of these beings had some kind of pre-Christian antecedent. And we know for a fact that's true with trolls. After all, there's documented examples of them in surviving source material. But even with this possibility, this kernel of earlier inspiration, there is also layers and layers of Christian-influenced folklore and oral tradition that is accumulated around beings like trolls, the huldra, the nokken, and the nattmara. And as is often the case with these kind of Christian-influenced spook stories, the goal is often to control, as well as to delineate what lies within the acceptable and what is within the unacceptable. With untamed, uncontrolled, one might almost say uncivilized nature, representing the greatest source of fear, concern, and potential panic. We also have to remember, while going along the way, the time and places where these different stories came from. As folklore that stretches deep into the pre-modern world, there were a lot of fully justified anxieties and genuine dangers which lay in going beyond the reach of candlelight and at least somewhat maintained tracks and routes. As I mentioned in the Havamal episode, around the whole question of paranoia in the Havamal, these were legitimately dangerous times. Not so much because there were bandits and wild men stalking from every corner in some kind of war of all against all, but more because there was quite a bit of uncertainty, fear, and limits as to what humanity understood about the natural world and also could do about it. There was a reason, after all, during the pre-Christian period, that exile was effectively a death sentence. Living alone without the supports of hearth, home, family, kin, and community was very dangerous, and even venturing beyond the confines of settled, controlled society represented great risk. And that's something that's also interesting when we talk about these different folkloric beings. Even though we've got layers of Christian culture that sit on top of these oral traditions, it's rather fascinating, as we'll soon see, that the danger they pose to the unwary traveler is less one of corrupting their immortal souls and more of a very real material threat to their physical existence. For fans of horror and all other things creepy and spooky, you may see something of a parallel between the creatures I'll be talking about today and modern-day cryptids. Beings like Bigfoots, Chupacabra, Mothmen, and all kinds of other more modern things that go bump in the night. Something which I think says that even with the advent of things like GPS, smartphones, and many other social and technological tools which one might think would cast enough light to banish away the darkness of ignorance and superstition. But perhaps what it is that's dwelling in the deep shadows we will soon be entering is based less in irrational misunderstanding and is more a reflection of deep primal fears and how we deal with them. So let's kick it off with trolls. Trolls are probably one of the most ubiquitous symbols of Nordic folklore in the modern world. Practically every souvenir store dealing in all things Scandinavian will have at least one little kind of troll icon. There are, of course, troll dolls, the trolls present in films like Frozen, The Hobbit, and of course the literary works that is based on, and many other places. Trolls are also very common in surviving source material, with references to them showing up many of the sagas and a lot of surviving folklore. They range from mischievous, not always that bright, and potentially dangerous beings of forest and mountain and cave to more potent entities like Angerboda, who is named as the Troll Queen. There are also figures like the Troll Wives, who are said to be skilled in the arts of magic and sorcery. So, what are the things that trolls generally have in common? They are often described as being large and powerful beings, though not always. In some legends, they are said to turn to stone at the first touch of the rays of the sun. They are often also described as being somewhat gullible and easy to fool, with many examples showing up in folklore of trolls being defeated not by brawn, but by brains. They, like many of the other animistic beings in Nordic myth, are often closely associated with different natural features. And there are many Norwegian folk tales which describe trolls as being the creators of things like specific mountains or craters or hills and other significant landmarks. In myth, they are said to be banished by Thor's hammer. Trolls also possess a very interesting relationship with Christianity. Many folktales exist which describe trolls as being enemies and opponents of the new religion. There are many tales of trolls ambushing priests, attacking houses of worship, causing natural disasters, and otherwise trying to impede the progress of the new religion within Scandinavia. Trolls were also said, possibly coming from these similar kind of folk tales, to be repelled by the sound of church bells and other similar holy signs. This particular relationship with Christian symbols and Christian power, which is something that's not going to show up for any of the other things we're going to talk about in this episode today, seems, at least to me, to carry some cultural echoes of the traumatic process that was the imposition of Christianity on Nordic Scandinavia. We know from surviving historical documents and accounts that conflict existed between Christian and non-Christian peoples living within the region during the period of conversion. Most of the first Christian kings of Norway ruled very violently and often waged war against the existing traditional religion of the region. It kind of makes a certain amount of sense, then, that at least some of what is viewed as being part of this animistic world would push back, or at least show signs of this conflict in some way. Trolls' reputation as causers of mischief and bringers of trouble also probably factors into this a bit. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if some enterprising seers or Seidh workers who were on the receiving end of encroaching Christianity and royal power turned to invoking trolls as a way of striking back against their adversaries. It wouldn't be the first time in history that a group of people took up the imagery and associations of a malevolent force within their myth as a tool of resistance. Regardless, this doesn't mean trolls are therefore inherently friendly or hospitable to humans or heathen practitioners based on this sort of shared animosity. Trolls are beings that are known again for their mischievousness and for how they tend to bring chaos and disruption wherever they go. That's also before we get into what happens to people who trespass on the domains of trolls, often in the deep forests and mountains. Trolls are far from the only thing going bump in the night that represents the dangers that are associated with going out into the wilderness beyond the edge of firelight. Present-day practitioners could see them as bringers of disruption that periodically need to be cleaned out and warded away. And it is certainly an interesting bit of synchronicity that trolling on the internet, which is banished with the ban hammer, is a thing that just sort of happened. If you want a good bit of horror that deals with trolls, by the way, I recommend checking out Troll Hunter. It's shot in sort of a Blair Witch style and does a good job of leaning really hard into Norwegian troll myths, as well as being a great found footage horror movie. Speaking of nature, it's now time to talk about the huldra. Huldra are described as extremely seductive and beautiful women who are found in the depths of forests and the wilderness. The one thing that sets them apart in their appearance from other people is they also have a long tail. They use their beauty and seductive charm to lure usually men off to their lairs, where Depending on the version, they consume the souls and suck the life out of their victims, or turn them into slaves to their will. Sometimes they also indulge in a little bit of catch and release, but not before implanting a curse in their victims, so they will always be drawn to return to the huldra. They're also said to inflict other hardships like stealing sight and wits from their victims, and otherwise punishing those that mistreat the lands that the huldra lives on. Not all huldra, however, are necessarily hostile. Sometimes, if a huldra is treated well and with respect by the person that they capture, then the huldra might let them go, or even propose to marry them, at which point they lose their tail and become a human themselves. This also probably depends on whether or not the huldra is open to such treatment in the first place. Some huldra are described as being more open to fair treatment, while others are depicted as being dangerous, unpredictable, and violent, much like the lands they live on. If the huldra are spirits of forest, glen, and woodland, then the nokken are much more closely associated with water. In contrast to the often feminine huldra, nokken are often depicted as being male and masculine in presentation. They often are described as using beguiling songs and music as a way of luring their victims into a watery grave, not unlike the Greek sirens. Nokken are also described as being shapeshifters and take on whatever forms are most beguiling to their intended victims, though, somewhat like the Scottish Kelpies, they will sometimes take on the shape of a horse that will then tempt the person to ride them, at which point they drag them under and drown them. Nokken are said to prowl along the waterways where they live, whether this is a particular lake or stream or even along coastlines. They're also said to hide under water lilies and other similar water plants as a way of disguising their presence and luring in the unwary. Some folk stories claim that speaking the name of a nokken will force the nokken to let their victim go. How one is supposed to get their name is another question entirely, but that's not exactly unprecedented in different European folklores. Metaphorically speaking, you could see the nokken and the huldra as being two sides of the same coin, complete with having specific, different gendered expressions. They each can be seen as representing the dangers and the uncertainty that comes from being lost or otherwise entranced when out in the wilderness. Trolls, when they come up in this context, tend to have much more directly violent or otherwise dangerous associations in a sense that feels more like catastrophes, like trees falling or rock slides, bad weather, and all the other kinds of things you can see in anywhere in the wilderness. The nokken and the huldra, however, are kind of fascinating in how they don't represent the same kind of direct violence. Both work through seducing their targets, luring them into danger, and drawing them away from what is safe. This is a very different sort of thing to be working through. That instead of the fear being of the kind of direct, very real harm that can happen when you're out in the wilderness, it's instead of becoming entranced or enraptured by the space, of being lured in, lost, almost consumed by the wild spaces, which, especially in the times when these stories came from, would have seemed even more trackless, mysterious, and full of potential dangers. You could also see this motif of seduction as a reflection on people succumbing to their pride or conviction that they understand a space better than they think they do. If you want a good horror movie to go with the huldra and the nokken, while I don't have any on hand that I can think of that directly deal with these particular animistic beings, the Blair Witch Project probably gets pretty close to what it might be like to be lured deep into the wilderness by a huldra or a nokken, promising whatever it is that's going to keep you going deeper and deeper into their den, before leaving some handy bait to entice more to follow. This brings us to what are probably one of the more unsettling creatures outside of the draugr, which are the nattmara, the bringers of nightmares. The nattmara are one of many examples of a similar kind of being that is described throughout Central and Northern Europe. They are where the English word nightmare originally comes from. They are said to slip through the cracks of doors and break into the homes of the sleeping, where they then sit upon the chests of their victims and ride them all night, leaving them exhausted, drained, and haggard from the experience. The nattmara are not depicted as being immaterial or ethereal, so to speak, but rather as being incredibly capable shapeshifters who are said to be able to transform themselves into sand and dust so they can slip through the cracks of doors, windows, and even through walls. Their appearance in folklore does not disappoint, especially for this time of year. Many sources describe the nattmara as being pale, emaciated women with long, stringy hair soaked in some unknown substance, and completely conceals their faces, though from how the nattmara are described in the source material, perhaps that is a blessing in disguise. As for where the nattmara come from, there are many stories that try to provide an answer for it. The myths themselves are old and probably predate Christianity, though one that does exist, which again is probably after conversion, especially given what it is that's said to cause the nattmara, claims that the nattmara were women who sought to rid themselves of the pain of childbirth, and as punishment they were transformed into the first of the nattmara. The nattmara are also described as being omens of death, and seeing a nattmara as a sign that you or someone close to you would soon perish. There are even some stories which claim that a nattmara might sometimes leave a grimy poppet in the living space of a particular family, and this poppet was a sure sign that someone in the house would soon be suffering from tuberculosis. When they were bored, they might also tangle your hair in knots, which had to be cut out. Because, of course, if you are a spectral apparition of death and suffering and horror, you gotta lighten the mood sometimes. A modern practitioner could see the nattmara as a way of describing things like sleep paralysis, serious nightmares, night terrors, and all kinds of other similar phenomena that folks know all too well, including even things like insomnia. In folklore, nattmara are warded off by nailing a horseshoe or otherwise placing your shoes at the end of your bed. Although, for a modern practitioner, you may want to also try what works best for you for dealing with insomnia and difficulties sleeping. their role as harbingers of death also reflects other similar beings in different bodies of folklore that have their own bringers of doom and woe. If you want a good horror movie to go along with this particular story, I'd go, of course, with The Ring, or the original Japanese Ringu. After all, a nattmara is a dead ringer for the thing that comes crawling out of the tape and even forces people to spread the misery around. Those who don't suffer horrible tragedies. It is also quite the horror classic and worth checking out on its own merits. And it does say something about the nattmara myth that broadly similar attributes for describing the nattmara would come up on the other side of the world in a completely different time period, doing very similar things. It's interesting how the human condition does that. Broadly speaking, it's also interesting how a lot of what these different beings do is also broadly similar to what you see with cryptids in the modern world. Creatures like Bigfoots, Chupacabra, the Mothman, and other similar beings haunt modern myth just as much as the nattmara, huldra, nokken, and trolls stalked the pre-modern Nordic world. Sometimes they are bringers of death and woe, other times they are misunderstood giants simply trying to live out in the world, far from human contact. Stories of cryptids also serve a similar folkloric role, as do other monsters, boogeymen, and other things that dwell just out of the corner of the eye and just beyond the limits of one's home. For the modern practitioner, you can see these different beings as a way of processing our feelings and relationships with the natural world, particularly the parts that are less forgiving, more dangerous, and to us may seem difficult to understand. You can also see them as a form of cautionary tales, as a way of reminding people of these potential dangers and hazards that exist in these places. They also make for some great stories, because after all, who couldn't imagine sitting around a campfire on a long journey at sea or on land and telling tales of things like shape-shifting horses, wraith-like creatures sifting through the cracks of doors to plague sleep, and any number of other things to help pass the time and give everybody a good little scare. All that said, if you do happen to be out in the woods at night and you happen to hear the distant strain of a haunting fiddle or a rustle in the bushes that sounds just a bit too big, it might just be time to say a quick word of thanks to Thor, make the shape of a troll's cross, and hightail it back for safer spaces. You never know when there might be something behind whatever it is that's going bump in the night. This has been Ryan Smith with The Wayward Wanderer, wishing you a happy spooky season, a spectacular Halloween, and pleasant dreams. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.